Are your deepest convictions just idiosyncratic fancies? Are they just your meinen? Or are they firmly rooted in the shared ethical life of the community? Are you relying on the prophetic chatter of your gut feelings? Or are you actually willing to put in the labor of the concept to discover objective truth?
Hi, I was doing two projects this week. One project was the explanation of what is called the third position of thought or with respect to objectivity, which is part of the introduction to Hegel's logic in the encyclopedia, dealing with immediate knowledge, intuitionism or subjectivism. And the other project was an explanation of the beginnings and the expansion of the charismatic movement within our current postmodernist era. So the connection between charismatic movement, subjectivism of the postmodern era, and then at the same time this third position with regard to objectivity that needed to be dealt with in the context of HegelCourses.com. And then I saw that there was a connection, even though Hegel had no idea about charismatic movement and certainly didn't predict postmodernism, but there is a connection. This third position explains the way the mind will work when it takes truth to be present in some kind of very strong feeling or sentiment or in some intuition. And that makes it possible to apply this third position with respect to objectivity to get the elements of the charismatic movement and elements of modern postmodernist subjectivism. So that's what ultimately the video is all about.
So we're exploring whether relying purely on inner feeling or personal revelation genuinely leads to objective truth. Hegel actually explicitly targets this exact mindset. He calls it the third position of thought with respect to objectivity, basically the realm of immediate knowledge or faith. This is a position that prioritizes feeling, intuition, and sudden revelation over structured conceptual thought. And it doesn't matter if it's a charismatic movement claiming direct spiritual inspiration or postmodern perspective arguing that universal meta-narratives are dead and we only have our subjective orientations. Hegel has a profound and honestly devastating critique for both. He warns us that abandoning shared rational frameworks for gut feelings doesn't lead to freedom at all. It leads to epistemological anarchy, where everyone is just kind of sealed up in their own little bubble.
To unpack this, we'll climb 4 dialectical steps. First, the cult of inner feeling. Second, the formal conscience trap. Third, the illusion of immediacy. And finally, finding freedom in Sitlikat. Let's get right into it. Starting with Section 1, the cult of inner feeling.
When people elevate their private inward feelings above rational scrutiny, Hegel views this as a sophisticated regression into subjective arbitrariness. And there's a really brilliant linguistic anchor he uses here, the German word for opinion, meinen. It's etymologically related to the word mein, which literally means mine. So for Hegel, an opinion is just the vanity of individual conviction. It's an idiosyncratic fancy. When someone rejects universal narratives and relies purely on my truth, they are essentially trapped in meinen. It completely lacks the necessity and universality of genuine science. It's arbitrary. Sure, it's yours, but that absolutely does not make it universally true or rationally valid.
Hegel powerfully contrasts this charismatic reliance on the direct certainty of the spirit, which he pretty dismissively calls prophetic chatter, against the rigorous, structured labor of the concept. Think about movements that rely heavily on sudden bursts of inspiration or the heart's revelations. Hegel argues this is a fundamentally unscientific approach because feeling is simply the wrong form for truth. Feeling belongs to selfish individuality. Your pure feeling can just as easily harbor what is untrue and evil as it can harbor the good. To reach objective truth, you literally cannot bypass the hard, sometimes tedious work of logical and conceptual development. Truth isn't just a sudden download to your brain. It requires the intense labor of the concept.
Now, let me show you something in the text that Hegel wrote. This is paragraph 65. And it says, dieser Standpunkt begnügt sich nicht damit, von dem vermittelten Wissen gezeigt zu haben, dass es isoliert genommen für die Wahrheit ungenügend sei, sondern seine Eigentümlichkeit besteht darin, dass das unmittelbare Wissen nur isoliert genommen, mit Ausschließung der Vermittlung, die Wahrheit zum Inhalt habe. Let me attempt to translate this. So, this position, we're talking about this third position with respect to objectivity, is not satisfied just to have demonstrated that mediated knowledge, so non-intuitionist, rational knowledge based on argument and syllogisms and logic, this position is not satisfied enough with to say that this mediated knowledge in its isolation, isoliert, is not enough for the whole truth, für die Wahrheit ungenügend sei, but it has a very specific characteristic, seine Eigentümlichkeit, its characteristic exists in this, that the immediacy of knowledge, or immediate knowledge, only taken in isolation, so very opposite, immediate knowledge has to be taken in isolation, and has to exclude, mit Ausschließung, with exclusion of any kind of mediation, has truth as its content. So what it basically says is that we not only argue that when we take mediated knowledge, logical, rational knowledge, that in itself it is not enough to take the whole truth, to accept and understand the whole truth, but the opposite, that only immediate knowledge in its isolation, so without any connection to mediated knowledge, has the truth as an object. So you see this kind of extreme gap opening up here. By its nature, intuitionism, subjectivism, and including the charismatic movement and the forms of knowledge in the charismatic movement, are not just telling us that there is that there is an additional source of truth, which is then intuitions and visions and whatever, but it has also to say that the opposite, mediated knowledge, is in itself insufficient. So there is a battle going on. Every claim to truth within subjectivism or charismatic movement or in postmodernism is supported by, needs that support, but is supported by claims that the opposite, mediated knowledge, rational knowledge, is insufficient. But it takes that rational knowledge in its isolation, and it claims something about itself in its isolation. So it puts two isolated forms of knowledge as contradictions over against each other, making them extremes. And on the one side there is purely rational untruth, and on the other side there is the truth as it is given in subjective intuition. That's important to understand, that thereby the immediacy of knowledge relies on a mediation, because the negation of its opposite is a form of mediation, and that without it the position of immediate knowledge and subjectivism, etc., cannot even be maintained. It has to perform this kind of contradiction, this kind of opposition to its own opposite.
Moving on to Section 2, the formal conscience trap. So, what actually happens to a society when subjective conviction becomes the sole criterion for truth? This illustrates our entry into Hegel's deeper metaphysics. When we deny that there's a big other, an objective, shared, rational structure to the world, we fall straight into epistemological anarchism. Subjects become sealed up in a paradoxical subjectivity. They can't communicate or justify their claims to anyone else because they've completely rejected the shared framework required to do exactly that. Without that middle term of communal reason, it's a very lonely, isolated metaphysics.
And this brings us to what Hegel calls the formal conscience. If conviction is the only rule, then the conscience becomes an incredibly dangerous empty vessel. It totally lacks an objective system of ethical principles. It validates literally anything simply because the subject happens to be convinced of it. When subjective caprice rules the day, like this, the fundamental distinction between right and wrong just collapses entirely. You simply cannot build a functioning society or a coherent system of justice on the premise that if I feel it's right, well then it must be right.
Which brings us to a crucial point, and it's a chilling warning from Hegel. Relying purely on sincere personal conviction can validate the most criminal acts as if they were universal laws. Think about it. If the only metric for morality is the intensity of my personal belief, then the thief or the tyrant who is deeply, sincerely convinced of their own righteousness is placed on the exact same moral footing as a saint. The formal conscience, when you strip objective reason away from it, is a terrifyingly destructive force.
Now let's consider also part of paragraph 66. Wir bleiben hiermit dabei stehen, dass das unmittelbare Wissen als Tatsache genommen werden soll. So Hegel is arguing that the only way to approach this issue is to accept that this immediacy of knowledge, this intuition, is indeed a fact. So we're not going to deny, we don't need to deny the experiences that are made within the charismatic movement or in postmodern subjectivism. But this does have this consequence. Hiermit aber ist die Betrachtung auf das Feld der Erfahrung, auf ein psychologisches Phänomen geführt. So with this statement, the analysis has now been turned into something that occurs in das Feld der Erfahrung, so in the area of experience. It's a psychological phenomenon and no longer a philosophical phenomenon. People experience sometimes truth like that. And he explains that. He explains that quite beautifully. Let me put myself here. So, in dieser Rücksicht ist anzuführen, dass es zu den gemeinsten Erfahrungen gehört, dass Wahrheiten, von welchen man sehr wohl weiß, dass sie Resultat der verwickeltsten, höchst vermittelten Betrachtungen sind, sich demjenigen, dem solche Erkenntnis geläufig geworden, unmittelbar in seinem Bewusstsein präsentieren. So there is one way to approach the psychological side of intuitions. There are experiences in which truths that we already know, and we know that these truths are the result of mediation, that is to say, the result of a rational process of understanding. They can appear to be immediate for everyone that has such knowledge, that has acquired such knowledge. And he gives an example of the mathematician who is able to see the resolution of a problem immediately because he has already acquired all this mediated knowledge before. So this opens up a possibility to see intuitions as the ultimate result of reasoning, whereby the person who tries to hold and claim these intuitive truths has to argue that this process of mediation is no longer part of the whole deal, is no longer necessary, simply by denying that it ever happened. People might have an experience, let's say, of a phantom or vision of God, but that might be the result of a whole series of the understanding of the possibility of such visions, and certainly the content of such visions will be determined by mediated knowledge and not given immediately. That's why visions and ecstatic experiences in the Roman Catholic Church differ widely from similar experiences within Islam, obviously, because there is a whole range of mediated knowledge that is actually brought to bear upon the experience or the vision that someone has. Very important point.
This leads perfectly into Section 3, the illusion of immediacy.
Here Hegel attacks the very premise that our gut feelings are pure in the first place.
calling this immediacy a mythical semblance. He famously describes the attempt to reach the absolute through direct intuition rather than discursive reason as the abyss of vacuity. He calls it a state of monotonousness, a night in which all cows are black. When you strip away all conceptual distinctions, all the hard work of categorization and historical development, just in an attempt to feel the truth directly, you aren't left with profound enlightenment. You're left with an empty, featureless void where nothing can be distinguished from anything else. You just hurl all meaning into a total abyss. He argues that both the charismatic leap and postmodern subjectivism fail because they essentially attempt to walk on their heads. They demand truth without climbing the necessary ladder of historical and conceptual mediation. The reality is, any truth that feels immediate to your consciousness, like a sudden spiritual insight or a deeply held subjective conviction, has actually already undergone a massive, hidden process of development, education, and cultural mediation. You didn't just invent your feelings in a vacuum, right? They're the product of your history, your language, and your community. So ignoring that mediation doesn't make your feeling more pure. It literally just makes you blind to where it came from.
Finally, Section 4. Finding freedom in Sittlichkeit.
Hegel contends that when people are entirely focused on inner feeling, they develop this homeless subjectivity. They often develop an actual hatred of law, or gazettes, viewing established social and rational norms merely as external shackles. But here is the ultimate contrast we need to make. Over on the left side, we have moralitate. That's private inwardness and subjective morality. It's the realm of the isolated individual relying purely on their own conscience. But on the right side, we have Sittlichkeit, objective ethical life. This is the shared, rational, communal whole. Hegel argues these modern subjectivist movements fail exactly because they refuse to make that crucial transition from moralitate to Sittlichkeit. They stay trapped in their own subjective orientations, totally refusing to recognize that true freedom requires a shared ethical reality.
And Hegel empowers us with a massive paradigm shift here. Genuine freedom is not found in private inwardness. True freedom is actually found in becoming an I that is a we. We become truly free by participating in public, rational practices where reasons are given and asked for. Modern subjectivism creates a homeless subjectivity that refuses the one and only thing that could actually satisfy it: recognition and participation within a rational, communal whole. You are most free when your individual rights and subjective insights are fully integrated into a logical, functioning community.
Ultimately, Hegel's critique reveals that objective truth demands way more than just personal conviction. It requires the shared, rigorous labor of the concept. It requires us to bring our empirical observations, our historical understanding, and our logical faculties together to build a systematic, unitary conception of reality. We simply cannot retreat into our own isolated minds. We have to engage with the world and with each other using the heavy tools of universal reason.
Are your deepest convictions just idiosyncratic fancies? Are they just your meinen? Or are they firmly rooted in the shared ethical life of the community? Are you relying on the prophetic chatter of your gut feelings? Or are you actually willing to put in the labor of the concept to discover objective truth? Because the choice is stark. It's between the abyss of vacuity or the rich, structured freedom of a rational world.
So what can we say by way of a conclusion to all of this? First of all, that this modern insistence on subjectivism and intuitionism in the charismatic movement, but also outside of that movement, is the result of an opposition, an artificial opposition, to mediated knowledge, rational knowledge that requires a logical procedure and arguments. Every claim by intuitionism or subjectivism is based on the exclusion of its opposite, which is in itself a mediation. Secondly, that intuitionism does not give us truth, nor does the formal, rational knowledge that it opposes. We need to see something else. That's the third thing, that every so-called immediate form of knowledge actually presupposes a mediation. It's a result of the removal or negation of the mediation process that actually led to the so-called immediate knowledge. The fourth point is that we should accept it as a fact. People think like that, they have these experiences, we cannot argue with that. We can only say that their truth claims are constructed in a very wrong way, that a society that would base itself on these postmodernist intuitionist claims is not really rational enough to sustain itself ultimately. Okay, thank you for listening. Hope to see you some next time.